It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 129 of the Property Podcast. I'm Rob B. Yes, you've guessed it. With me is Rob D. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning. Joining you this morning from a building site in the Netherlands, but luckily the microphone seems to be cutting out most of it. If you do hear any drilling in the background, I'm very sorry, but it's 20 times worse for me. Anyway, today, really exciting day. If you're listening on the day this comes out, it is the day of our very first Property Hub National Meetups. And to celebrate that, today's episode is about 7 questions to ask other property investors. But while the meetups are big news for us, there's some big global news going on as well. So we're fitting in what's happening in China almost as an afterthought to what we're up to. But we're covering all of that in today's episode, as well as giving you a great resource of the week. So plenty to pack in.
And we have been packing plenty in. This week, we've been working on the front line in the trenches of yellow lettings. So we've been taking on lots of new staff. For those who are working with Yellow, they know we're working on something we call Yellow 2.0. which is a lot of changes, big investment that Rob and I have been making in the business with the team. And this week, and ongoing in the business in the future, we're going to take a day out each month to work in the business, on the front line, answering the phones, answering the emails, which has been incredibly valuable.
Yeah, it's been so useful. We both did it this week. Rob, you came away with a list of about 14 things or something that we could improve on. I came away with about 7 or 8. And it's just so helpful because you actually get first-hand experience of what you're having to deal with and how the systems are performing. And it also means that you come away with even more respect for your staff because it's just so hectic. And I'm not cut out for it. You have to hold so many different things in your head at any one time. And so I think one day a month is enough for the good of our clients. I don't think we should be doing any more than that. But I think that the day itself is really valuable. So I'm really glad we started doing that.
As am I. But something else I'm really glad we've started is the meetups, Rob. Tonight is the first night. We've got a few running tonight before next month when we've got a lot running. But congratulations and well done. And thank you so much to the brave people who are the guinea pigs, if you like, and doing the first meetups across the country this evening. They're the people who are going to go out, test the model, see how it works, host you, look after you, treat you well, and give you the Property Hub experience. So that is happening tonight across the country. Most of the venues are starting at 7 p.m, but you can get all of the details where they are and next month, where the majority of the new ones are coming in, all on our website, which is thepropertyhub.net/meetups. That's thepropertyhub.net/meetups. So make sure you check that out because there is pretty much every area covered, within reason, next month. This month, we've got a handful, so you might be lucky and it might be one of your areas. So just off the top of my head, I know we've got Liverpool running this month. I know we've got Birmingham running this month. I know we've got Nottingham running. I know we've got South London running. Hong Kong has actually happened. That's unreal. I spoke to the lady who set that up this week, and that was really cool. And that will be happening on the same day as everyone else from next month. So it's really exciting how quickly this is taking off.
Yeah, it's brilliant. We had a conference call with the leaders of those meetups the other day. What a lovely bunch of people. They're going to do a brilliant job, I know. And if you take a look and there isn't a meetup in your area and you'd like there to be one, and you've got a little bit of time to spare, not a lot, every month to step up and be the leader of that, just let us know. Drop us an email to hello@thepropertyhub.net and we can talk to you about that, because we want it to span absolutely everywhere. The idea that on the first Thursday of every month, wherever you find yourself in the country, you can go and talk property with a friendly bunch of people is something that we're really excited about. And starting next month, we're going to be popping up at a different meetup every time as well. So I'm really looking forward to getting out there and meeting lots of people.
So before we get into our core content this week, which is all around networking and best practices and questions you can ask, there's been some pretty big world events going on. And China has been grabbing all the headlines for what you could say the wrong reasons. It depends on your perspective on these things. But China certainly has been grabbing the headlines. So the other side of the world, but China now, if something happens there, very much like America, it can affect everyone. So, Rob, you found a couple of good articles that can really summarise this and give people who want to understand what's happening an idea in sort of a concise way.
Yeah, so I was obviously aware that this was happening, but I hadn't been following the situation in a lot of detail. So when it was time to catch up, I found a really good summary of the situation in The Economist. So if you go to the show notes for this week, which are propertyhub.net/questions to ask, there's a link to this Economist article, which has a really useful overview of what's happened, why it's happened, how it might affect the rest of the world. And there's also an interesting fact in there which I wasn't aware of, and I've linked to another article in the show notes as well, which goes into that in more detail, which is that 75% of Chinese household wealth is stored in property compared to just 28% in the US. So that's something that I wasn't aware of at all. And it just, I suppose, means that the impact of a possible property collapse could be even more devastating than it otherwise would be. But Rob, you made a really good point about this when we were talking just before we hit record.
Here's a few things to take into consideration. First of all, stock market crashes tend to be then followed by real estate property crashes. So a big stock market crash, if we look back through history, a property market crash happens not too far after. If this crisis in China continues and it goes on to be a full collapse, then do expect the property market to go within the next 6 months as well as a follow-on from that. But as Rob said, to China, that actually will be a lot more devastating. And something we've pointed out before, China has a massive oversupply of property now. So it really wouldn't come as a shock if this happened. It's something we've been talking about for a while. And the predictions show at the very beginning of this year, we talked about it, how we expected China to go. I'm not saying we're right yet because it hasn't played out fully, but certainly this doesn't come as a surprise. And to those I've spoken with, it's not a surprise to them either. The other thing that I find interesting is that while lots of the wealth is stored in property, those investing in the stock market are lots of individuals. So in the Western world, it's mainly big funds that buy the majority of the stocks and shares, so it's wealth funds or pension funds or what have you, that they're the ones buying up the majority of the shares. But in China, there's a lot of individuals who are buying shares. They're just the individual consumer market. Now, that is very similar to what happened in America in the Great Depression. It was the individuals who got punished because they got caught up in the market. They got caught up in a boom, started leveraging and went into a crash. Very, very similar to what's happening in China now. So individuals could be the ones who are punished here rather than companies. And could that have a more devastating effect on the economy because it's the individuals that are hurt? Quite possibly. For all the pain that's being caused by this, if you put that aside for one moment, which, you have to consider, it is very interesting that, history repeats itself so often. The other thing of recent history repeating itself is now that China is pumping more debt into the country. The government is creating more debt, and they've already created a lot since the crash to generate this boom. But now they're creating more debt to sustain this boom and stop this crash happening. Now, if that works, they're just pushing a problem down the road. This will happen because they're just creating more and more debt. The amount of debt they're getting up to, the levels now against GDP, is huge. The lessons of 2008, which is not that long ago, are completely being forgotten. And the amount that banks need to hold in reserve has also been reduced. It's just balmy. Okay, I can understand why you've forgotten lessons from the 1920s, but forgetting the lessons of 2008, it's just, I don't know. It's crazy. You have to accept that sometimes you need to deleverage. And I think that's what's going to happen with China.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And how will it affect the UK? Well, what happens in China affects the US, and what happens in the US affects the UK. In terms of our property market, Rob, you said earlier that it could affect central London, zones 1 and 2 at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Rob said, the US will be affected by China. We follow the US. Interest rates in the US are expected to go up. If China really kicks off, expect that not to happen immediately. Also in the UK, then expect our interest rates not to be going anywhere soon if China really does kick off. As I say, it's an if. We'll have to see if it plays out. And then if it does happen, the Chinese property market does collapse, then prime central London could be affected as well, harder than anywhere else in the UK, and then a possible ripple effect across the country. This could be that mid mid-term wobble we talk about in the 18-year property cycle. Now, if you've not listened to the 3 episodes we've done on that, please go back and listen, because we've also cited China as being at the top of that 18-year cycle. Something else we've talked about, So this, Rob and I were discussing this before the podcast, does not come as the slightest shock at all. It was expected. The midterm wobble of the 18-year cycle could happen in the next year or so. That's nothing to worry about. You just need to understand it. In fact, there's a time for opportunity, because the best growth happens after the midterm wobble. However, China will go into the bigger slump of the 18-year property cycle. I'm not going to go on too much about it now, and especially if you've not listened to those episodes, because it won't make much sense to you. But we'll link to all 3 of those episodes in the show notes, because it is extremely valuable, because these type of things you can make predictions on. It wasn't that I got a crystal ball out when we talked about the Chinese property market going. It was because I just followed past trends, and the 18-year cycle being one of those.
Yeah, and as I say, every time we talk about the 18-year cycle, don't get hung up on the 18-year part, because you could argue about the timing until you're blue in the face. But the key insight for me that changed my thinking is that markets are cyclical. And when you appreciate that markets are cyclical over roughly that kind of period of time, and you know the signs and the signals that demarcate one stage from the other, then that allows you to make predictions and make smarter decisions. So don't throw out the whole theory just if you don't buy into the 18-year part. I think it's immensely valuable. Okay, onwards from China, closer to home, to our topic of the week. Our first monthly meetups, as we've said, are tonight and will be the first Thursday of every month from now on. Now, we've got a friendly bunch as Property Hub members. We're very lucky to have such a lovely group of people. Everyone we come into contact with is just great. But still, networking can be intimidating. I'm not a natural networker. I find it scary. I don't really go to networking events. I'll go to our own, of course, but it's not something that I do regularly. But there are ways of making it easier. I'm far less intimidated by it than I used to be. And I think the reason for that is that I realized that it's not about me going out there and selling myself. It's about having great conversations. And the key to having a great conversation is to ask the right questions. And that's why in this episode, we're giving you 7 questions to ask other property investors. Questions that you can choose from to lead into a great conversation. So you don't have to go up to someone and grill them by working through all the questions in order. But the idea is that it just gives you a way in. Like, the scariest thing is walking up to someone and not having anything to say. So this gives you something to say. And they're designed to open up the conversation and progress beyond the small talk, to help you get to learn about each other's goals and backgrounds. So if there are areas of shared interest and ways you can help each other out, you'll actually get to learn about those, rather than just talking about the weather for 10 minutes and then moving on and never finding out that relationship could have been there. So that's what this episode is all about. Rob, why don't you kick us off with our first question?
So I love this first question, and it's not because I put it down. Rob's put these 7 questions together, but it's one that I use all the time when I'm meeting potential clients or just networking with property investors. And the question is, what's your why for investing in property? It's something that hardly ever gets talked about, but it's probably one of the most important things, especially for the reason is that you may learn things when you ask this question, but actually you often help the person you're referring the question to, because they don't always, it's not a natural thing to think about the bigger picture, the why, the motivation. And when you have that why, it can really help you push on. So understanding other people's whys is really interesting, but actually it's a really good question because it brings the best out of the other person. If they really take the time and effort to answer it properly, if they go, I just want to retire, that's not really good enough. But if they say, I want to retire because I want to do this, this and this, or I hate this, or I want to get out to that, you often stir passions within people. So it's a really good question because you can bring out something that people are passionate about and give you a stronger connection early on. So a good question to ask, maybe not your first one, but when you're in the conversation, is what's your why for investing in property?
Yeah, that is a really good one. Okay, second question. What's been your biggest success so far? And the way that that's worded is kind of deliberately vague. So if someone hasn't done an amazing deal where they've made tens of thousands of pounds or really pulled something incredible out of the bag, they're still able to answer that question because everyone has their own definition of success. So asking about someone's successes is great because it's a positive thing, and everyone likes to talk about things that have gone well and talk about things that they've done well. But if you put pressure on and say, what's the best deal you've ever done, or what's the biggest amount of money you've made, then that can be not only a bit intrusive, but it could also make the other person feel bad if they perceive that you're more experienced than they are and they feel like they're inferior. They might feel like you're asking it as a kind of almost like a trick question, so you have an opportunity to jump in and talk about your better success afterwards. And that's not what it's all about. By saying, what's the biggest success so far, then people can interpret that in any way they want. And you can then sort of use that as a springboard to take the conversation in a positive direction.
Another question you can ask is, what are the pros and cons of investing in your area and how did you choose it? So if they invest in a different area from you, you can really learn to why they zoned in on this area and maybe learn something new, maybe something to look out in your own area, or maybe even consider the area they're investing in. Or if you both invest in the same area, talk about your favourite areas to target within them and why you've invested there locally and what's drawn you both there, because there might be different reasons, so you can learn from each other, and there might be a real sweet spot in that town or city that you'd not previously considered before. The other thing is, one, if it's a different area, people like talking about something they know, so they can talk about their area. But two, if there's an area that you both invest in, then there's that instant rapport. So it's a win-win from either angle. So it's a great question to ask.
Question number 4. What are the criteria that you use to determine what to invest in? And how do you decide on those criteria? So I think this is a useful question as well, because it really gets people thinking. And it gives you an insight into the thought processes of different investors. When I was writing Beyond the Bricks, which is a book I wrote where I interview lots of different property investors, I found it really useful to get an idea of how their minds worked and why they made the decisions that they did. And that improved my own decision making as a result. So this is effectively accomplishing the same kind of thing. By asking what criteria they use to determine what they invest in, you might get a very precise answer. So when I've asked that question to people before, I've had people give me a precise numerical answer of like, I want this percentage return on investment, or I want the rent to be this amount, or lots of other factors, or they'll even say it has to give this percentage yield, be this far from a station, and so on and so on. Or it might be that the other person isn't consciously aware of it, so that then you'll actually get them thinking, and they'll start thinking back over different things they've bought and noticing patterns about why they've done that. So it's quite interesting, because if you're dead set on what it is that you invest in, then by learning about someone else's criteria, if they're very different from yours, it might give you more insight into the choices that you've made. Or if you haven't decided yet, if you're still early in that process, then you'll be gathering lots of data from lots of different people and kind of seeing what options there are out there. So it's quite a detailed question, but it can lead the conversation in interesting directions.
Now, one of the most popular parts of the podcast is not our incredible wit and humour. No, believe it or not, actually, it's the resource of the week. So a good question you can try is, what are your favourite resources? What have you found helpful with your learning during this process? Now, after you've both said the Property Podcast and the Property Hub, of course, then you can talk about other things that you may have found useful. It may be apps, it may be educational resources, it may be a book, whatever it may be. People love discussing their favourite apps, resources, whatever you want to call them, and sharing something they've discovered. So it's a real easy one to get into conversation over, because everyone likes their favourite app or their favourite resource or their favourite book. So it's a real easy, light conversation starter that seems to work well. And judging by the amount of requests we get and praise for the resource of the week section of the podcast, not the incredible valuable content in the middle, but the resources at the end, then I'm sure it'll go down well at a networking meeting. So make sure you use that one in your armory, because it's a great question to ask.
Another great one to ask, kind of tied into the first question about what's your why. What are your goals for the next year or two? This is a good question again, because it can actually help the person that you're asking the question to. If they're not clear on what their goals are, then by being asked the question, they'll start to kind of go over that in their own mind, which will be beneficial. And if they haven't already watched our free goal setting course on the Property Hub, you can recommend that they do so. But also it can pull out kind of areas of commonality and overlap and where you can help each other out. So to give a really simple example, If the person you're speaking to says, oh, well, I've just been doing buy-to-let up till now, but I really want to get into some flips. I've got some cash and I want to be doing it, but I just don't have the time, but it's something I really want to get into. That's also something that you want to do and you've got the construction skills, then bingo, there's a potential partnership. You obviously don't leap straight into a deal straight away without knowing anything more about each other, but it's a starting point. So by asking the question about goals, you can see if there's any overlap between what you're each trying to achieve, or even if there's not, it might be that they say something and you can think of a third person who'd be perfectly placed to help them with that, or a resource. But until you know what someone's trying to achieve, you can't help them. And networking, great networking, is really about helping people and mutually benefiting rather than just trying to further your own agenda. So that's, I'd say, a critical question to ask at some point in the conversation.
And word of warning, if you do meet me, it's probably the question I'm most likely to ask you. People laugh now when within 30 seconds I say, so what are your goals? Because they hear me talk about goals so much on the podcast. But really, it is an incredibly valuable question because it really helps the person. As Rob said, you're asking a question too. So that's one to expect from me, but you may have other people ask it as well if you go to the Hub meetups. And last question, what do you know now that you wish you'd known when you were starting out? Great question. People ask me this in property and in business, and it allows me, when I'm asked the question, to give lots of value back. And if you ask the question to someone else who's a bit further down the line than you, then you can get that value as well. And it's a question I ask people who are a bit further down the line than me. So it's a really, really useful question because it can give you instant wins. Just real nuggets of knowledge or information that could save you hours of time or thousands of pounds potentially. That's a really, really good question to ask someone who may be a bit further down the line than you. So make sure you've got that one up your sleeve to ask if you meet someone who's a bit more experienced. Really interesting question. But this week, our resource of the week, very timely. Tim Ferriss obviously knew about this podcast coming out. And Rob, he's released a podcast to complement ours.
Yeah, this is one that I haven't listened to yet. I know that you have, but it seems that while we've been focusing on kind of specific questions, he's talking more about general principles to use for networking, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's best practices, habits, how to get the most out of networking situations, do's and don'ts. Really, really interesting podcast. So we've mentioned the Tim Ferriss podcast before, but our resource of the week this week, because I know some of his podcasts can be a bit lengthy and it's like, which ones do you listen to? But this one in particular was really, really valuable and goes hand in hand with this episode. So we'll link to it in the show notes, of course, which you can find at thepropertyhub.net/questions to ask. So if you go to thepropertyhub.net/questions to ask, you can find a link to that podcast, you can find a link to the 18-year property cycle podcasts, and you can see all these questions in written form as well, plus everything else we've mentioned. So if you'd like to get the show notes, go there, make sure you check it all out, listen to that podcast as well in tandem with this one, and you will be the ultimate networker.
I was going to say another great way to build your network is to leave us an iTunes review, but that's not strictly true. But we'd appreciate it all the same. So Rob, this is why you do these links. I just can't do them. Why don't we move on swiftly and have you read out this week's review?
Okay, and it is a swift one this week. It's from Wilkster5, and he or she says, having become an accidental landlord, I've started investing for passive income. These podcasts are fantastic to increase knowledge and pass on tips. Always look forward to the next one. 5 stars. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that review. And if you'd like to leave us a review, as we mentioned, we're close to 300 now. We'd love to smash through that. So if you'd like to support the podcast and just give a little thank you for the stuff you're using, if you enjoy it, of course, then please go to iTunes, leave a review. We will be eternally grateful.
Okay, that is about it for this week. Next week, really looking forward to this one. Really interesting question. Should you focus on your strengths or work on your weaknesses? That is actually, it was a debate that we were having between us a couple of weeks back. This would actually make for a really good episode of the podcast. So I think that's going to be a really great discussion. So that's coming up next week. In the meantime, if you haven't booked your place on one of tonight's networking events yet, there's still time. Just go to thepropertyhub.net/meetups and book your place. It's completely free. And I hope after listening to this episode, you're even less intimidated and even more excited about getting out there and meeting your fellow investors.
And remember, you can go to the meetup for free the first Thursday of every month. So if you can't make it tonight, or you're listening to this a little late, go to that link, as Rob said, thepropertyhub.net/meetups, and find out where the next ones are near you, how far you need to get to, because I promise you it'll be worth the travel if it's not on your doorstep, because the property hubbers, I don't know what we're called, but we're a friendly bunch. So make sure you get along, because you will learn a lot, build a network, and property investment, it can be a lonely journey. So don't make it lonely. Get yourself along to an event. Plus, it's free. Until next week, when we'll be discussing strengths or weaknesses and having a bit of a chat/debate. Until then, everyone, have a lovely week, and we'll be back with you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.